Hi, I'm Felicia Tomasko, and I'm here at Loyola Marymount University Center for Religion and Spirituality. And this is, this podcast, and I'm excited to be here with Dr. Judith Carlisle. And Dr. Carlisle has a PhD in Management Information Systems, and she is a graduate of the MA program in Yoga Studies at Loyola Marymount University, where she is also an instructor and facilitator in the Yoga, Mindfulness and Social Change program that is part of the Center for Religion and Spirituality at LMU. And this program has been around for several years and is such a great way to bring together conversations around yoga, mindfulness, social change, social justice, and is so important in the times in which we live, so relevant in terms of how these different disciplines come together and how we, as people who practice yoga and are interested in yoga, can offer some reflection in terms of the times in which we live and how yoga can be both a tool for personal and community transformation. So, Judith, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
Mm-hmm.
I'm excited to be here with you today.
Yeah, and I just want to say that I've been honored to participate in different aspects of the Yoga Mindfulness and Social Change program. You've taught in the yoga therapy practicum classes for the students, talking about issues of, racism, equity, diversity, inclusion, and all of these things are really top of mind in so many areas of our life right now, and in so many areas of the cultural discourse, and so many areas of, where yoga fits into these conversations. And so I'd like to start with, how would you define or describe social justice in the context of a yogic perspective? Because I think that's something that many of us are grappling with right now. And in terms of yoga, mindfulness, and social change, this is an important conversation.
Right. So I'm going to start by talking about justice itself. And I'm going to say this, that justice is a really hard thing to define. It's an abstract concept, and it's hard to reify it. When we do, we frequently miss the point. So a lot of times we make justice happen on earth with law. But even though justice is a difficult thing to define, all of us know what injustice is. And this is a point that my sister actually makes a lot, that we might not be able to say what justice is, but all of us can say what injustice is. And we know when we experience injustice, we actually feel it. So it's a feeling, it's an experience. And so we know when we've experienced injustice, but at the same time, it's a little difficult to always know when somebody else or some other being has experienced injustice. So we can experience our own, but we can be blind to the injustice of others. Social justice then takes from this broad idea of justice. And we frequently think about social justice in terms of access to and the distribution of the resources that people need to lead a good life. And so social justice then emerges as we see things such as some people or groups having access to the resources and that support a good life, and that other people or groups are denied that or don't have access to it, or even having access to it, don't have the ability to use it. So that's how I'm going to approach the idea of social justice itself. And then to tie in what yoga is, what social justice is in the context of yoga, I want to talk just a little bit about an idea of yoga. And in the Yoga Studies MA program at LMU, one of my professors was Dr. Christopher Miller. He has a definition he describes yoga in this way. It's a set of changing practices. He says malleable practices that basically reflect the social historic context of the world that they emerge in. So where yoga shows up is what yoga is, and there's these, and it changes. And so right now, that yoga is showing up in a world that has a lot of injustice in it. So then the issue becomes, how do we take yoga and kind of apply it into the world? In the last century that we just left, then we saw yoga really, really participating in some of the most important social revolutions. In India's fight for independence, yoga was a critical part of Gandhi's Satyagraha. In the passage of the 1964 Civil Rights Act in the United States, Martin Luther King Jr., who was aware of Gandhi's teachings and practices, worked with James Lawson of Los Angeles, the Reverend James Lawson, to train his activists, his protesters, in nonviolent protest methods. And the nonviolent protests that they engaged in and led others in was fundamental to the eventual passing of the 1964 Civil Rights Bill. And other major political figures in the 20th century, I'm going to go to Nelson Mandela and Cesar Chavez, also used yoga and mindfulness techniques such as fasting, such as meditation, to sustain themselves as they led other social revolutions. So we see yoga participating in major social change through these political avenues. And into the 21st century, I hope that I'll have an opportunity to address this again later. In the 21st century, I think that we see a really big shift in culture and society that makes yoga's relationship to the pursuit of social justice change. We no longer see the ability to create ad hoc and changing political coalitions. We have such social division. And so then we come back to the idea of yoga and social change, how yoga can be an intentional instrument of social change, and that can lead to social justice by altering our relationships with ourselves and our ability to conduct relationships with others.
Well, in hearing you say that, there's an aspect of yoga that is our personal practice, right? And the personal pursuit of yoga, and the emphasis on sadhana, and the emphasis on what we do personally in terms of our own transformation. How does that then relate to our individual transformation and our transformation in these movements that you've mentioned? How would you suggest yoga practitioners take this personal practice and bring it to the planetary, or bring it to the political, or bring it to what's larger than ourselves?
Yeah. So I experienced yoga as this transformational practice. I also experienced it as a transcendent practice. And I'm going to use an expression from Bill Maher that I've heard him say, that I don't know it for a fact, but I know it's true, that a significant number of yoga practitioners come to the practice because they are in some sort of pain and they want to alleviate that pain. And that pain can be emotional, physical, psychological, or other. And so they come to the practice, and frequently we come to the practice with ourself in mind. Then the practice itself, two of the most widely recognized texts of yoga in contemporary times are the Yoga Sutras and the Bhagavad Gita. And I'm going to make this distinction between them. I'm going to say that the Yoga Sutras present yoga as a transformational text, but more of it lays out an internal journey, a journey toward this transformation and this transcendence of pain, if you will, about ourselves. And we can understand that kind of teaching that comes from the Yoga Sutra. Social change, then, well, let me back up because I'm comparing them or contrasting them. The Bhagavad Gita it takes this path of transformation and puts it smack dab into the world. So rather than focusing on ourselves, we see ourselves and our ability to transform within the context of the world and the impact then that transformation has on the world. The Prince Arjuna's conflict in the Bhagavad Gita was that he had as a warrior, he was supposed to fight as a warrior on the battlefield, and he had a lot of conflict with that. And he had to go through a transformation that would allow him to take his place and act in a way that would sustain the just world, that would recreate and sustain a just world. So we see that text, then that teaching from that text makes that available to us. So, but I think a lot of us experience the same thing that Arjuna experienced. We don't always want to do what we're supposed to do. And so then yoga takes this place as a transformational practice because it gives us this discipline, and then through this discipline we can create this space to act in responsible ways, to act in socially responsible ways, and then we can take our actions, direct them away from ourselves because our practice gives us this discipline. And then I love to say, focus outward. So, Martin Luther King has a quote. It's one of my favorite quotes, and it has a long theological history. And he says, he's quoted as, the moral arc of the universe is long, but it bends toward justice. And I love that because in yoga, we are finding a way to live more ethical lives, and we can live them within ourselves, but we can also actively work to make this moral arc of the universe bend toward creating greater justice for everybody. So through this redirecting of our practice from an internal practice about ourselves that we must do in order to gain the sattvic mind, the disciplined mind, we create the space that we can interact better with one another, and then we can direct our attention to the world and take the practice outward. That's
and speaking about that, and I think you have so many great historical examples in taking the practice outward and using the techniques, whether it is mindfulness, whether it is fasting, whether it is nonviolent communication, or even nonviolent assembly. You have so many great examples of that. So what is the role of the yoga practitioner in the world today as an activist? And thinking about yoga in our time, this podcast, what is the role of yoga in our time for the yoga practitioner / activist?
So I'm really influenced by the yoga studies program. And so frequently this is what I want to say about how we should act. First of all, when I think of activists, right, the word, I don't know if it comes from one or the other, but when I think of activists, I think of this word to act. Activists act. And it's a big part of yoga, right? That karma, the idea of karma is a big part of yoga, and it actually means to act. That is one of its definitions. So in yoga, we act. And I think that is the role of the yoga practitioner in the world today. Once again, I'm going to come back to saying that we direct our practice outward. We gain certain benefits, outcomes from our practice, and that allows us to be more effective in the world. So I'd also say then that yoga practitioners, because we have this access to the practice, we have an obligation to take the practice and direct it outward. There's some problems here. We all know, we learn more and more that the access to the yoga practice is uneven and is actually unfair in and of itself. And one thing that when we think about yoga and social change and social justice, one of the issues that we grapple with a lot is making yoga more accessible to everyone. But anybody who has access to the practice, however they get it, if it's Nelson Mandela in Robben Island jail prison, there's access to the practice, and we benefit from that practice. And then we have an obligation, I'd like to suggest, to push that practice out into the world. Something else that activism makes me think of is protests. I think I'm a child of the 60s. In the 60s, we saw a lot of activism become protests with the goal of creating social justice or bringing social justices, making our nation, making the United States aware of social injustice. Activism as protest also, on the flip side, it embodies, right? You have these protesters, these activists in the world, they're out embodying this desire for more justice. And so then we have this idea of the practice embodying something. And so we have this quest of social justice. I return to this idea then that the yoga practitioner as an activist in the world takes the practice out. We take the space that we create within ourselves out into the world. I had a yoga teacher who used to say, you know, your yoga is working because your relationships get better. So the yoga activist becomes active in the world by, first of all, becoming better, gaining the ability to better manage our own emotions, our own selves, and then going out into the world, taking the routes that are available to us, and that's going to be different for each and every individual, and it's going to depend on the place in society where we live, our status in society, the people that we are able to influence. But then again, that purview of influence, the realm of influence, we can manage, we can enlarge it, we can broaden it through things like fulfilling our civic duty by voting, by going out and learning about the issues. There's the expression that if you aren't part of the solution, you're part of the problem. And I think that can be really challenging for a lot of people, particularly in the time that we are in now, because there's so many problems. And we become aware of more and more each day. It's just like all kinds of learning. The more problems we learn about, the more we realize there are in the world around us.
Well, that brings me to, so listening to you talk about that, it feels as though some of the examples that you're giving, whether it is protests, whether it is, discussion of injustice, whether it is participating in a democracy through voting, that the goal of many things is to change or influence legislation so that there is more policy around justice, inclusion, and equity. Mm-hmm. And that in doing so, as an activist, for us to also take action in ways that are nonviolent, inclusive, and clear. Mm-hmm. And so what I'm hearing too is there's an aspect of the benefit of our personal practice of transformation and transcendence that allows for clarity of the action that we take in the world, that allows for the ability to be, say, nonviolent and not be triggered by others' actions that may be unjust, or to not be triggered by actions that may be ignorant, and to stand up for others. And to also, there is a value in yoga of seeing clearly and seeing the truth and not being clouded by deception. And I think there's an aspect too of the great divisions that we see in the world right now, where there is a clouding and there is a proliferation of deception.
Yeah.
So what I'm also hearing you say is the importance of this cultivation of clarity through yoga practice, that is also what both transcendence and transformation can lead to, is taking actions with clarity that are for the benefit of not just oneself, but one's communities.
You've summed it all up really nicely. Thank you. I think as we are now at the beginning of the 21st century, however, the type of clarity that we can gain, it has shifted, it has changed. And yoga can shift and change to help us achieve the type of clarity that we need now. So one of the big,
which I was just going to say, we have these great examples of the social movements of the 20th century and social movements where there's the influence of yoga. And then how do we take that into the 21st century?
So in the 21st century, what makes it different, and how does yoga have to change in order to remain this powerful instrument of social change? And one of the biggest issues that's different from the 1900s and the 2000s is we touched on this before, right? The huge division and within our nation, these widening gulfs that separate us from one another. You brought up the word triggering, the inability that we have to interact with one another as we without triggering one another, without creating situations that are so intense that we cannot interact. In addition, in the 20th century, in the 21st century, let me put it this way, there are a lot more voices at the table, many more diverse voices have taken their rightful place at the table of discussion and creation of policy than were there in the 1900s. And those voices demand an acknowledgement of social injustices that we have tried to put away from us before. And as many cultures around the world where the victims of injustice frequently don't have as strong a voice to represent themselves. But we see that voice, especially last summer, the Summer of Freedom, really emerging again, but much more diverse. And groups that weren't at the table of social intercourse have more of a voice now to speak their truth. So what does that mean in the 21st century? Let me take a sip. I come from management information systems, and one of the things that we deal a lot with there is actual problem solving. The nature of problems and problem solving. And one of the things that we learned first is you can't solve a problem until you know what it is. And in the 21st century, we are starting to go back to the roots of the problem rather than covering them up. The United States, for instance, has problems of slavery that emerged with the indigenous people, not only losing their land, but being enslaved on both in North America and continental North America, and then going out into the Caribbean. Where am I going with this? As early as de Tocqueville, he noted that the United States had a slavery problem and we hadn't dealt with it. The issues that arise from slavery become a really good way of examining almost every social injustice that exists everywhere in the world, because it was such an oppressive institution. So, and every ism, racism, sexism, genderism, speciesism, all those isms, they arise from our inability to cope with the idea that that injustice is a natural process where superior naturally rise and have the right to oppress others. I will leave that aside as I go on to say, then where does yoga take us? At the moment, I wouldn't describe our problems as political. I would go one step back and say our problems come from an inability to acknowledge injustice among others, to actually name it. And not naming it, then we don't know, we avoid defining the actual problem.
Mm-hmm.
This inability to interact with one another effectively, and then this ineffective interaction makes it so that we when we're at the table of discussion, we can't name the things that cause injustice. We can't even say these things. There are words more and more that we can't even say. And so yoga then allows us to reimagine the space of oppression, and then create a space and turn it into the space of opportunity. Once we gain the ability to interact with one another, that is gained from the clarity that we have of ourselves as we take on this practice. It reverberates out to the people that we interact with, and then it can ripple out. So we have the social change aspect, and then we direct it towards social justice. Being more effective as individuals, we become more effective in the groups that we belong to, and we can then pursue real solutions to problems more effectively. And then I want to go back and say that then the role that yoga plays is that we each have different means to interact in the world, through our relationships, through our work, through social groups that we belong to political groups that we belong to, as we fulfill our basic roles as our civic duties as individuals in the world. We can take the clarity and the perspective that we gain from yoga and use that to direct the world to, I'm going to say, right, to bend that moral arc more toward justice. But we do it intentionally. It doesn't come about merely because we practice yoga. Mm-hmm. Because we practice yoga, we gain this insight, and then we take it and say, I'm intentionally going to identify a problem that I can be effective at solving. And then I take the means and the tools that I have gained through my relationship with yoga and my more effective relationship with others, my ability to overcome my own biases, to see more clearly, to see the suffering of others, to empathize, and then to direct my attention and my actions to creating change. And that's wrong.
Yeah, and in speaking about that, and I love what you said about the means we each have to influence and create change. And speaking about this, we have a couple of questions that have come in from the people watching this live. And one is, do you think the pandemic has changed how yogis address matters of injustice?
So do I think that the pandemic has changed the way that yogis address injustice?
Yes.
Okay, definitely. I think the pandemic has changed just about everything. So for some people, the pandemic has been an opportunity to shut ourselves off from the world and become introspective, and and through our practice, use the new challenges of the pandemic to discover more about ourselves and the world. Other people have been tossed out into this maelstrom of the world without protection because of the pandemic, and have to reassess their relationship to the world. And many of those people are people who practice yoga. Mm-hmm. And so yoga does not protect us from the ills of the world, but it also shouldn't, we shouldn't try to use yoga as a way to separate ourselves or protect ourselves from understanding the suffering of others. So through the pandemic itself, we kind of sat around, maybe stewed. We saw this awareness of injustice, this experience of injustice burst out of the seams as we saw people who were tossed out into the world suffer injustice. An obvious example is George Floyd. We lost some of our ability to turn away from it and to pretend that these things didn't exist, or that somehow people brought these injustices in upon themselves. Conversations started to include phrases such as systemic racism and injustice. We couldn't deny it. Hence, we had the summer of freedom, where protesters took to the street to embody this desire for justice and to make this awareness of injustice, to put it in all of our faces. And I think the pandemic and it's the fear that it brought about, the recognition that we are not the masters of our fate in all ways. It made us definitely have to begin to grapple with this. And the yoga world also had to grapple with this. We saw the closing of the studio system, and that made many people have to turn to individual practices or find other ways to create social allegiances or alliances. And so these are at least two impacts of the pandemic on the practice. And at the same time, it brought many, many opportunities for people to say, what can I do in order to overcome the injustice in the world that I see myself as part of? We had the reemergence of this concept of anti-racism, which has roots at least back to the Quakers in the 1600s. And this idea that if you aren't doing something, then you're allowing these injustices to perpetuate. This is a new global consciousness that I believe is emerging as a result of the pandemic. Somehow the veil that protected us from seeing all of this was ripped from our eyes.
Well, and that's also, if we're really practicing yoga, we do learn to see clearly. There are, and I don't want to go down too far a road of spiritual bypass or anything else, where sometimes we can use our practice to keep ourselves from seeing clearly. But this relates to another question that somebody watching right now has asked, that says, Judith, you are speaking directly to why I practice yoga, but don't feel that my yoga teachers embody that same commitment to social action. Are there any websites, resources, or teachers you can recommend? Of course, we will say that the Yoga Mindfulness and Social Change program that's offered at the Center for Religion and Spirituality does have an emphasis on this kind of inquiry and this kind of connection between yoga and what, the difference between seeing clearly and engaging in spiritual bypass. But what else would you recommend for somebody who's speaking to this as this questioner is?
So unfortunately, I did not come prepared with a list of resources, but I can direct you immediately to some. So the question is, my yoga teacher doesn't have this perspective, and I don't get this from my yoga class. And let me just first address this by saying, it sounds all yogic and spiritual, but we are each in a particular place. And because one person does not have a focus, doesn't mean that the focus that they have is not invaluable. That said, where can I go? How can I find people who have this perspective with mindfulness, with yoga, and this idea of pursuing social justice? So there's a lot of books coming out. One is by an author named Michelle C. Johnson called A Skill in Action, Radicalizing Your Yoga Practice for Social Justice. The title, and I'm sorry for tearing up the title, it's something like that. And there are a number of other books really emerging that come from the voices of the mindful communities, both spiritual and secular, from the yoga communities. Some places, there are a number of researchers who are looking at the relationship of yoga and justice. One of them is Sabrina Strings, who is in the University of California system. online. Oh, you know what? I was listening the other day to a podcast that called Yoga is Dead, a bit of a difficult name, that also deals with these issues. I would like to say, not to make this a commercial for the Mindfulness and Social Change workshop series, but this is a resource that has been developing for a number of years and is precisely about examining the issues of social change and injustice, its relationship to yoga and the mindfulness practices, with thought leaders from around the world who have a relationship to yoga mindfulness and directed specifically towards social change. And many of them have articles, online podcasts, or other presences that make them available. So by visiting our page and seeing who are speakers, that can serve as a resource to broaden your relationship to the many issues that can be addressed. Incarceration of particular populations and how to help them regain their role, take their voice back in society. Injustice in the homeless, groups that are excluded from yoga, including racial, ethnic, or body image. The foundations of injustice in the world, and how particular insights in how to relate yoga to those.
And we can add a couple of, thank you. And we can add a couple of links to this as well. And to say, and I love what you said, Judith, too, that everybody's at a particular place in their path and their practice and their teaching.
Yeah.
And you can find teachers, outside of your typical circles who you start to find that alignment with as you keep seeking, right? And the teachers that you have now may be beautiful teachers for certain aspects of yoga, but we remember that yoga is multifaceted.
Yes.
It is really multifaceted. And we have another question to your point about access. I find many of the yoga studios in my community to be expensive, or franchises of large companies that are also expensive. Are there such things as nonprofit yoga or community-focused studios? Mm-hmm. And this also relates to something you mentioned too, Judith, this particular listener question that has to do with the pandemic upending things like the studio systems that had been in place. There are still these expensive or franchises of large companies, and this question of access around yoga is such an important one. And what advice would you give around nonprofit yoga or community-focused studios, or, the question that this person is asking?
It changes from location to location. So let me talk about the United States, where yoga is very expensive. And there is the issue of access and inclusion. First, you have to get the $20 to pay for the yoga class. And then you got to spend $120 to get the clothes that make you look like you belong in the yoga class, and $150 for the mat, which super prices a lot of people out. And that's not what yoga should be. So you can visit, I would say almost every major city in the United States does have at least one nonprofit yoga studio. A lot of yoga studios are nonprofit by definition, meaning there's not a board of directors, or they haven't gone public to invest or develop wealth from the profit, but are expensive because people are trying to make their living off of the studio. But there's also community-based and donation-based yoga, and you can find a lot of these. There is a wealth of free yoga that is available on a number of social media platforms. And I have this phrase that I use. I said, I believe that exclusion creates exclusivity. A lot of online yoga gives an opportunity for groups that have been excluded from mainstream yoga to create their exclusive spaces that are geared toward addressing things such as yoga as a practice to enhance your your commitment to social change, to social justice. And you could find these with a search, and I'd be happy, Felicia, to work with you to identify some of these practices that are definitely directed toward social justice, social change, and yoga through mostly the asana practice, but through also some meditation and others. The answer to your question, to the question then, is yes, these teachers do exist. These outlets of instruction do exist, and you can find them. And there are a lot of them, and you can find one that is useful to you. There is a website called Decolonizing Yoga that deals with a lot of these issues and also provides some resources. But please do check back here for some resources that we will get up quickly.
Absolutely. And I think the questions also reveal there is a hunger for this information, and there's a hunger for how do we integrate different aspects of our practice and how do we embody this clarity. Mm-hmm. So I do want to say, Judith, Dr. Carlisle, thank you for speaking to us about yoga in our time. And these are the questions that we're working through. How do we utilize our practice of transformation and transcendence to see things more clearly? How do we utilize the lessons from our practice to be able to encourage greater access and accessibility of the practices themselves to communities? How do we use our voice to encourage other people's voices? And these are all the questions that there are not necessarily easy answers to, but they are answers that come through our daily inquiry.
Yes. Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Definitely. I would like to thank you for the opportunity to speak today. And I really do hope that that this has whetted a few appetites and then also helped people, our audience, see that this can be an intentional pursuit. And this can be something that you align your yoga with. And this can be, this is something that capability that you already have inside of yourself. We play a lot with the term of dharma and what it means. Frequently, we translate it as duty, but we can see that we can create in our lives. We can take a place in this pursuit of social justice. We can use means that are available to all of us to become people who actively look for ways and find them to make the world more just, and that yoga will be a practice that sustains us as we take on that challenge, and that also opens many doors to give other people the insight that they can then go forth with, and that lay have ideas of social justice that we can build on to make the world a better place. It's part of the practice, it's part of the philosophy, and it's part of all of our dharma. Thanks so much for letting me have this opportunity to speak.
Well, Judith, I think that you are such a great example of yoga in our time. And what does it mean to live a life of dharma, to live a life of utilizing practice for means that aren't just personal, but are community-based. So thank you for being a living example of a teacher of these practices of yoga in our time. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much.